after. Because it said Stanley and J. Kirby. Well, I knew who J. Kirby was, although I didn't know why he lost those 3 letters in his first name. But I knew that Stan was the writer and editor, and I became aware of him as an important writer at that moment because I'd never read any of those monster comics, Fin, Fan, Foom, Son of Goobum, and Goom, and whatever they were. But as soon as I read Fantastic Four #1, I knew that, you know, something different in not just the art was good, it was Kirby, but that the writing was, you know, much better in a certain, little more adult, realistic way than the comics writing as I generally knew it, certainly in the 60s. So, in that sense, so I wrote a review, like it came out within about 2 weeks or so of the Fantastic Four #1 that talked about how good it was. So that's the moment we're talking about.
Yeah, was that Alter Ego you did that review, is that right? Was it Alter Ego that you did the review for?
I did it for Alter Ego when it was being done by my friend Jerry Bales, but it ended up being in the first issue of a thing called The Comic Collector, which was the first ad zine, sort of, yeah.
What about you, Steve, and Jean-Marc? What was your first impression, or your first time you actually knew who he was, actually understood what he was going to be as well?
Well, my first contact with Stan was actually writing a letter when the French edition of Marvel Comics started appearing in 1969. Strange enough, they were published by the publishing company which I now own, so that's a kind of strange twist. And of course, like most of you, he was an idol to me. But I met him and worked with him when we set up the Mobius Silver Surfer story, Parable, and he was a wonderful, wonderful man. I mean, he was a great man to work with. He was a delight. I mean, he was really the man that the legend has portrayed.
Yeah, I did what a lot of, at least American kids did, which was I read comics when I was little, and then I outgrew comics. And it was in my first year of college, which sad to say was the spring of '66. Another guy on my dorm floor ran up to me with a Spider-Man and shoved it in my hands and said, "You have to read this." And I did. And it was Stan's writing that sold me. I mean, I'm probably sitting here today because of that event. It was Ditko artwork for Spider-Man, and that was cool too, but it was the writing that really, you know, impressed me. And so that's when I first encountered Stan. And this was, again, '66, so it was several years. Yeah. The story was going along, and then all of a sudden there was this editorial balloon that said, "You guessed it, this guy is a full-time nut." And that, you know, I thought, well, that's not the comics that I read, when I was a little kid. So that's what set me on the road with Stan.
Yeah, I mean, that was all about building the bridge between the reader and the artist and writer. That was the key thing, really. He was trying to create this little club, with the Merry Marvel Marching Society, and having names for everyone and all that sort of thing. And so he kind of built it up from there. I mean, did you think, Roy, the early '60s, did you think it was going to lead to something huge? Did you see it overtaking DC at that point? Did you think anything like that?
I'm glad you said that, because even just the idea of being as big as DC, it had been such a small, little, tiny company when in 1961, when it started out with the Fantastic Four, just a leftover rump of a company that had been fairly big years before. It had gotten better, bigger, and more popular by '65 when I went to work for Stan. But the idea, I don't think, Stan was kind of content. I mean, he was pushing, but he was kind of content that we were always going to be number 2. They had that rent-a-car agency in the United States, Avis, that had the motto, "We try harder," because of Hertz. That was the big one. And Stan liked to, either quote that or paraphrase it, and that was the whole basis of the Not Brand Ec and all the stuff that he did. But then all of a sudden in 1972, about the time he got himself kicked upstairs to become publisher, that was about the time we had to expand a little in order to pay, extra salaries. I didn't get a raise. we had to hire a controller and things, so we paid out with more books. And at that time, we became bigger for the first time. But it never would have. I would never have imagined, even a year or two earlier, that Marvel would be bigger than DC.
You remember he actually did say, and the banner would read, "We're number one, but we still try harder." That was, as I recall, that was what
I'm just going to jump in quickly on that. I went to work at Marvel in '72, and to cover everything here, I only overlapped Stan by 6 months. After I'd been there for 6 months was when Stan went to California. So then, Roy's the Stan expert. I'm not. But during that 6 months, that was the period when Marvel surpassed DC in sales. And Martin Goodman, who was the publisher, took us all to dinner at DC's favorite restaurant to celebrate that. So that was the point, 72, when they overtook DC.
But Stan was still around. He was still in New York till about 80. Yeah, he was just publisher, so you didn't get to see him.
I thought he went to LA.
I think it was like 78 or 79 when he left New York to. I have a story actually that covers exactly that period. As I mentioned, I was working with Mobius, and Mobius was the founder of the French magazine Métal Hurlant, who then became licensed by National Lampoon and became heavy metal. I think we started in 74 about then. And there was a story that got told to me by the person who was the art director of National Lampoon. And what you have to know is, at the time, the Marvel offices were in the same building. 625 Madison? Yeah, wherever it was. Anyway, they were in the same building as the National Lampoon and Marvel were in the same building. And I guess you're familiar with National Lampoon, and in the early days they were getting a lot of hate mail. And one day they got a box with a bunch of dynamite in it, with a message that says, something like, if you continue doing what you're doing, this is what's in store for you. But there was no clock, no wire, nothing. So, they started playing with the sticks of dynamite, kind of throwing them around the office and goofing around and all of that. And Michael O'Donoghue and those people. And then after playing with it for an hour or so, they said, well, we've got to do something with those sticks. Well, so they called the fire department because you have to dispose of it. So the fire department picks up the call and they said, how are the sticks? Are they wet? Are they sweating? And they say, well, they're a bit wet. So there was a silence on the line. And then the fire department said, that's nitroglycerin. So what you have to do is do not touch it, do not pick it up, leave it exactly where we are. We're going to send a crew to dispose of it, big boxes with sand in it, and then take it with tongs and then put it in the box. And they said, meanwhile, call the building manager and order the evacuation of the building. So now I'm going to pass the microphone to Roy because he was there at the Marvel end of the story.
And just so you know why this is a Stan Lee story, among other things, although it's good on its own thing, is that the first any of us knew of this is a couple of people came in to see Stan, or they got a call or whatever it was. I suddenly looked up. I had a desk right opposite, the little hallway, and then there was his office. And I look up, and there's Stan. Comes out of his office and looking neither to right nor left with his, he's like 6'1" or so, with his long legs, strides, doesn't run, but strides very quickly out of the office, not talking to or looking at anyone. And then they kind of quietly come into the rest of us and tell us there's been a bomb scare or whatever phrase they used, dynamite. You have to evacuate the building. So we walked out, not quite as fast as Stan. Never saw him again for the rest of the day. I don't know. And so we all went downstairs. Then we suddenly looked around. It was milling around. We're right outside the building. If it went off, the bricks, would have fallen on us. We didn't have enough sense to go across the street. Nobody made us. So we're standing around. We were, I think, 2 floors above, or I think below the Lampoon. And people, some of them did work for the Lampoon at that time. So we're milling around. We suddenly say, somebody's missing. It turned out that the resident recluse of Marvel was George Russos, a very good comic artist who at that time had become the colorist, and he had been inker as George Bell earlier. If you see those early issues, Fantastic Four and so forth, he was a kind of a recluse, so he had fixed up a bunch of the big file drawers around him so you could hardly see him. He liked to be in private, and so nobody thought to tell him, or he heard it, but he didn't believe it. So somebody had to go up and kind of drag him down. He's always coloring. He says, this is just nothing. So anyway,
like the George Costanza of Marvel.
Yeah. So it turned out that we all got out and we milled around. We didn't know what was going to go. Last thing I remember is I just went off and got a haircut. I figured, the hell with this, And nothing blew up, but those guys are throwing around these sticks of dynamite. If it gone off, I mean, it'll all come crumbling down on us, But I can believe Michael O'Donoghue and Michael Gross and Doug Kinney and these guys. I can see them doing that up there. Anyway, but the thing I remember the most is Stan. I never saw him walk quite as quickly, as that day.
It's a related story. and again, Roy will know this better than I do, but I'm telling it anyway. There was a blackout in New York City at one point where the entire northeast of America was blacked out for some period of time, and everybody went downstairs except for Stan. And when everybody was allowed, when they got the lights turned back on or whatever, people came back in, and Stan had written an entire issue of Thor by candlelight during that time, right?
Well, almost. It's close, but no, what happened is the blackout was at 5:30 in the evening, and Denny O'Neil, who had just come to work, he and I were on the subway heading down to the place we shared, and but what happened is, the whole Northeast, as you say, was blacked out. No, Stan hooked up he and his wife hooked up a what he called a candle brigade in his house, and he, with his 2 fingers, he typed out a whole comic book. I think it was Daredevil or something. So the next morning, Denny and I come in. We had stuff to write, especially me, and couldn't write it, with no, portable electric. We came in with nothing, but we got a good excuse. We just sat around, drink. Stan comes in, not only with this whole story written, but with another story, an issue of Sergeant Fury, that he apologized to the production manager, Saul Brodsky. He said, well, I couldn't really finish this one last night. We had a blackout, like we didn't know it, And I remember it because that's when I inherited Sergeant Fury. He said, I didn't have time to write this, so you write it. So I became the Sergeant Fury writer. I was halfway through a Millie the Model comic, so I had to give up that easy one to Denny, and that he inherited that. But yes, Stan wrote that whole,
And one last thing about that. I looked it up one time. I don't know if you probably know this, but I mean, at one time, Stan wrote everything before he hired Roy and before he hired Denny O'Neil to be his assistants. The last month before he hired assistants, he wrote 13 comic books, ranging from the Fantastic Four to Millie the Model, right? I at my best, I was doing 5, right? He was doing 13 before he decided that maybe he needed other people to help out.
Well, he always needed them. He just couldn't. Well, his brother Larry, but Larry wanted to get back to the westerns. Larry Lieber, his brother, didn't want to write that stuff, and he was trying to find somebody, but he just, he never found anybody. I was the first. Then he found, Denny, my friend Gary Friedrich, and then we found, Steve came wandering in and different people and so forth, and. But it took all of us together to sort of make up for what Stan was doing, and I don't know if we did it as well, but we added a little something, we subtracted a little something.
I think my next question was going to be about his work ethic, but I don't think I need to ask that now, really. It's a machine. A machine that has
his
been
play ethic he wasn't so good at, but work ethic he had.
Yeah. I mean, it's connected to that in a way. It's about his persona. I mean, I don't know if many of you own a copy of Fantasy Masterpieces #1 from about early 60s. There's a picture of Stan before, i.e. as a company man wearing a suit and tie and a hat, and not much up there, if you see what I mean. And at some point in the mid-60s, he morphed into the Stanley that we know now, the persona that he evolved into, morphed into, I should say. That persona, did you find it Was it kind of, did you feel it was a little bit put on? Is that being unfair? Was he kind of trying to be this larger-than-life character even when you were at Marvel, or is that fair to say that?
Well, there definitely was the Stan persona, but if you knew him, there were only two Stanleys. There was the one that we knew, we all knew, and then there was the quote-unquote Stanley. That was true of Mobius too. I mean, the fans who saw Mobius behind the table or whatever, they never met the real man. I think there is that persona, you know. Stan never forgot really his origins. I think the real Stanley was very modest, did not brag about his accomplishment, even though he could have in some respects. I'll tell you a story actually that kind of shows what the real Stan was like. And that's a story I got firsthand, so I really believe it from two different people. In 1985 or 86, Marvel was sold by its then owner, Cadence Industries, to New World Pictures. That was the first time, basically, Marvel was sold to Hollywood. And at the time, I think it was sold for either 65 or 85 million, I forgot. And at the time, people in Hollywood made fun of New World because they thought they were grossly overpaying. And that Marvel was sort of mildly making a little money, but not a lot. Nobody in Hollywood was really interested in the characters. And people like CIA, the big agent, was thinking, why on earth is New World paying 85 million for what? You know, it's so funny. So the lawyers from New World went through all the documents and all the contracts and all of that. And you know, in those days, a lot of the paperwork was sort of not very good. I think you got them to sign Bill Everett at the time. That was Goodman who got. I don't think they ever got Carl Burger's signature, did they? Yeah, on the Human Torch. Anyway. So the New World lawyer looked at the paperwork, and there is absolutely no contract, no paper between Stan Lee and Marvel, other than the fact that he works for Marvel, but there is no contract. So the New World people tell Cadence, they say, well, if we buy Marvel, we're buying Stan Lee, so you better get something signed by Stan. Otherwise, there is no deal. So the president of Marvel, a gentleman named Jim Galton, is being tasked to travel to Hollywood to go to Stan's house and get him to sign a contract. And he has in his pocket a check for, I think, $1 million that is to give to Stan as an inducement to sign this contract, without which there is no deal. So Jim Galton goes to Hollywood, goes to see Stan, and he kind of explains the situation. And he says, you see, Stan, I mean, there is no contract. He doesn't mention the check. He says there is no contract. And what Stan hears in his head is, oh my God, I'm going to be fired. Stan is the guy who lived through the Great Depression. And even though he's invaluable to the company, he's its #1 asset, he's so insecure that when this guy comes from New York and tells him that they're going to sell the company, but there is no contract, instead of thinking, oh my God, I can make like a bandit, what he hears is, oh my God, I could be fired. So he said to Jim Galton, oh yes, you're right. I need a contract. Where do I sign? And he signed the contract, and Jim Galton went back to New York with his check. And that was Stan. You see, that was not the Stan the man and all of that. At heart, he was still the guy who grew up from Jewish immigrant from Romania in the Bronx and lived through the Great Depression and worked very hard to get a job and all of that. And I think that's kind of sad but very endearing in a way. That's a real Stan.
The funny thing is that at that particular point, you know, I'm as big an admirer of Stan just about as you can be in many ways. But you know, the funny thing is, at that stage, I'm not sure that they wouldn't have been overpaid in a way. because, you know, Stan wasn't that valuable to them anymore. He had left the comics, so he wasn't running the comics. They had Jim Shooter running the comics and Jim Galton running the comics. He had a lot of people writing him. Stan wasn't writing any. He's out in Hollywood, but he was never able to sell anything except a few cartoons. So while, you know, he was worth something, but I don't think he was worth as much as, you know, the $1 million. Just now, eventually, of course, it would be more. But my feeling about Stan is the more, I don't want to say useless, because he was always useful to the company and so forth, a great figurehead and inspiration. But the less he actually did that was important, the more money he got and the more famous he got, you know. But that's okay, because at basis it make a difference. I mean, you know, how many things you have to do that are great to be, you know, to earn whatever you get from there on with it. Not just him, but, you know, and people didn't get as much, but although they did okay. The Lees and the Kirbys, they're really this couple, well, those three, you don't need to mention anybody else. But, you know, you don't have to, Stan had earned that $1 million and many million more by getting the thing started with, you know, what he did and the way he held the Marvel Universe together. I've always said it's possible to imagine Marvel Comics without, say, Steve Ditko. I mean, it wouldn't have been as good because you wouldn't have Doctor Strange, and especially Spider-Man, or he wouldn't have been as good as Spider-Man. But it's possible to imagine Marvel without Steve Ditko. I can't imagine it without Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Without those two, it didn't exist, because Stan couldn't have done what he did without the wonderful artwork of Jack. And while he never realized it, Jack's work would not have had the value and the universe-creating value, because Jack didn't think that way, that without Stan, you know. And Stan valued Jack more than Jack valued Stan, but neither one of them valued the other, I think, quite as much as they really, you know, should have, because it was those two together that really made the universe. Kirby, Ditko was kind of the Holy Ghost of the trio. Nobody quite knows what he does, but he was there, you know.
No, I just have a question for you, because so whose decision, how did it get to be Stan Lee Presents?
Oh, Stan Lee Presents? Well, yeah, when Stan got, you know, worked behind the scenes to become publisher, and I was going to become the story editor before he became editor-in-chief, and about in that time, he called in, and you know, I could tell he wanted his name to continue on the books, which was no great surprise to me, you know, and nobody wanted to take it off, you know, nobody was trying to get rid of Stan, quite the contrary. But he couldn't quite figure out what it is. So I was, you know, kind of pleased with the fact that I suggested, you know, I said, look, you know, I said, why not just make Stan Lee Presents? You know, so that was sort of my phrase. But if it hadn't been, it would have been something. But I liked the idea that instead of it being down in the regular credits, where it looked like he was actually writing it, just make it like a masthead thing. It didn't say what he did or didn't do, or it didn't matter if he saw the books or didn't do it. He was just presenting it, you know. So he became Mr. Presents at that stage, yeah.
But it kept his name on every book.
Which we wanted, you know, yeah. I don't know when they took it off. Was that, who made the decision, I wonder, to take it off the book?
God, you just didn't notice it. It was after the direct market thing came into being, and maybe that's when they took it off. I can't remember, late 70s, early 80s, I think. At which point he was off in Hollywood anyway. I mean, just one little question about Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, the architects of Marvel, well, the Marvel Silver Age, I should say. I mean, they had a fractious relationship. We know what happened when Kirby went to DC. He created a character in Mr. Miracle, sending up Stan Lee. It was called Funky Flashman. Did you really spot that at all, that sort of politics, or was it just in the background, or you didn't really notice it at, you know, between Lee and Kirby?
We noticed. Yeah, Stan, you know, got those books. I mean, Marvel was sent the DC books, and DC was sent the Marvel books, just as a courtesy. And I remember being in Stan's office, and he had seen this. He was, you know, kind of upset, because he saw this character that looked something like him, and it's called Funky Flashman, and he was, you know, if you've ever seen the story, it's a very unlikable, egocentric, you know, kind of character. I mean, it bears a sort of a vague resemblance to the Stan Lee persona that he presented in the comics, kind of hyped up. And he's got this assistant called House Roy, which was a good name, I gotta admit that. I like that. But Funky, and I didn't care, because Jack and I really didn't know each other very well. The funny thing that happened later, you know, Stan was, you know, kind of upset, but, you know, it didn't, you know, it didn't make him feel any more kindly toward Jack, but he still wanted him back. So what happened in 1974? 74. No, yeah, in 74. I went to the San Diego convention as a last-minute guest, and Jack and his son Neil, maybe somebody else was there, wanted to talk to me, because already the bloom was pretty much off the rose after a couple of years, 2 or 3 years at DC, and Jack was looking to come back. You know, Jack, you know, always got to hate anybody he worked with eventually. what do you feel about my maybe coming back? You know, I'm not that happy at DC, etc. And I said, well, I just played with it. I was partly playing with him a little bit. You know, you got to have a little fun. I said, well, you know, Jack, I said, everything is fine. He loves your work. He never wanted you to leave. Didn't know he was leaving until he called and say I had quit. But he said, you know, it was a kind of a problem. He was really kind of hurt by the funky flash. But I said, I didn't care about House Roy because that wasn't that nasty. In fact, I looked good because Stan sacrificed me, so I looked noble, like Chop 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 in Mad Number 5 or something, you know, thrown overboard. So that was okay. But I said, you know, he was kind of hurt by Funky Flashman because it kind of seemed like a vicious attack. And Jack just kind of gave this kind of self-conscious laugh. Said, well, you know, ha-ha. It was all in fun, you know. And I just didn't say anything because I wasn't going to lie to him. I knew if there's one thing that was not, it was not all in fun, you know. So I just said, yeah, okay. So, you know, and of course, then about a year later, nothing happened right away. I stepped down as editor-in-chief. Jack didn't make a move for a little bit. About 75 or so, I'd come into the office once or twice a week. Just I had a desk there, you know, and so forth. And I'd come in, and Stan calls me into his office and says, guess what? He says, you know, it's finally working out. Jack wants to come back. I said, great. You know, he says, what do you think? I said, well, get him back. I said, but don't let him write. You know, I said, don't let him write because I didn't like the new guys writing. You know, I loved the plotting, but not the writing. He says, well, Jack says if he comes back, he has to write. I said, okay, well then get him back and let him write. That's better. He says, well, I said, it's good, but he says, that's what I think, but he says, there's a couple of people around here. He didn't say who. I never knew who the people were on staff. You know, obviously people whose opinions he at least listened to that don't think we should have him come back. You know, I said, they're idiots. I said, we know that, you know, so just ignore them and get him back. He says, okay, well, that's what I was going to do, but I just wanted to say, so, you know, for some reason, I don't know who it was, but some of these people just couldn't understand that Jack had a value. I said, look, having Jack at Marvel is better than having him at DC. Whatever he does, you know. So anyway, Stan got him back, and it didn't work out for that long, for a couple of years, but, you know, it was really nice to see Jack at Marvel. Now, of course, we'll have, an Eternals movie coming out because of that. Maybe there'll be Devil Dinosaur if we're really lucky.
Yeah, I thought Stanley was very gracious when Kirby came back. He read on the Bullpen Bulletins page, "The King is back, enough said." That was very good. And immediately, I think he took over from you, Stephen, on Captain America, as I recall.
Yeah.
That was his baby.
Yeah, I had. Yeah.
Not that.
Well, I had actually come to a stopping point as far as I was concerned with Captain America. They offered me actually a black and white Thor magazine, and I thought, well, that will be fun. And then that never actually panned out. But so I had left. Kirby then followed me. He didn't take it away from me or anything like that. But you know, my Captain America was, shall we say, more fully rounded than Jack's Captain America. And I heard when Jack took it over again, he said, my Captain America never had a crisis of conscience, you know, so, I mean, you know, no, I don't think so. I mean, because he couldn't write, as you say. He had the worst ear for dialogue ever. Which is why, I mean, that's why, again, Stan and Jack, they were both geniuses in their own field, and together they did what they did. But, you know, but Kirby thought he should write, and that was too bad.
Yeah, those Fourth World books they did at DC were somewhat impenetrable. I mean, I've tried to read them. They are interesting, but they're pretty unfocused as well.
I have to say, some people really like his writing and feel New Guys is the best thing Jack ever did, and you know, maybe in some ways it is. But that could have been a Marvel comic anyway, because I remember about a year before Jack quit, I don't remember the drawing, but Stan showed me a bunch of drawings that Jack had sent him, and they were that kind of drawing. It made, you know, it was probably Orion, these guys, you know, and it said Jack has this new book he'd like to do. He says, you know, but I just don't see that we need it, you know, that, you know, it's like another Thor, whatever, you know. And I didn't hear the title New Gods or anything, you know. And he just, but unfortunately, you know, I mean, if it had been me at that stage, you know, I would have said, have him do it. If Jack wants to do something, we get somebody else to draw Thor or something for a while. Have him do another book. Keep him happy. You know, I mean, if there's one fault that I feel Stan had, it wasn't the ego. He had ego, but you need ego just to survive in the business, and you know, Stan survived real good. You know, but if there was one weakness that he had sometime, it's that he wasn't ever good at putting himself in the position of other people and thinking how they saw him and how they saw Marvel and, you know, and everything. And so he would think that somehow he could kind of charm people and mollify them into doing exactly what he wanted. And, you know, and what actually happened, of course, is that when you tell Jack Kirby you can't do this new book, and he feels responsible for a lot of the stuff he did and everything, you know, it just makes him brood and just made him more likely he'll leave. I think that there's one where you or I or Marv Wolfman or Shooter or anybody would have been smarter than Stan and would have said, have him do the damn book.
Well, and also, you mentioned that the stuff was impenetrable.
Is that being unfair, do you think?
Yeah, years later, I was working for Topps, and they'd got the rights to Captain Victory, I guess, and they wanted to do a new Captain Victory thing. And I came up with the concept at that point. I mean, it hadn't occurred to me before, but reading through the published Captain Victory that Jack had done, I said, you know, there's a lot of good ideas in here. They're just impenetrable. You should publish this again in English. Anybody, I mean, if Jack had just handed that stuff off to any professional writer, you could have done so much more with it than he was able to do. But he, you know, he felt he needed to write at that point.
You know that he finished, well, one version, but you know he finished the New Gods in Captain Victory. Yeah. At the end, it's all Darkseid and Orion, and Captain Victory is like the son of Orion. Yeah. So basically, but he changed the name, like Dark Mass instead of Darkseid or something, or Black Mass. But it's completely impenetrable. Yeah.
I think, yeah, the concept.
We're all going to get, you know, denounced on the Jack Kirby list here or something, like we're foes of Jack Kirby, and I don't think there's anybody on this. I don't know you very well, but there's nobody else out here that isn't a huge fan of Jack Kirby's work. I mean, since I was like 5, 6 years old, back in the middle 40s, you know, and everything, when most of you were a sparkle in your grandfather's eye or something, you know, I was a fan of this thing called Simon and Kirby that I saw, and I didn't know who drew what. Sometimes it was Simon, sort of imitating Kirby at that stage. And anything that had the name Simon Kirby on it, even if it didn't have a great art style. And the thing is, Jack was a pretty good writer for that day. The Boys Ranch and stuff he wrote was actually pretty good. But somehow or other, something went kind of wrong, and he went off in some weird direction over into his own version of elf speak or something.
I think conceptually he was terrific, but as you say, he kind of tried to move with the times a bit, getting more cosmic, and it.
On the other hand, Stan couldn't draw very well.
There is that. No, we weren't. We're not denouncing Jack Kirby. He was the greatest. That's the key thing about him. He rewrote the book. He set the template for everything that came after him. Massively important. One last thing about Stan Lee and that sort of a persona about him being a little bit of a Carly Barker. Let's not ignore that. Was when he did the Origins of Marvel Comics, those Simon Schuster trades in the 70s. So you had those, you had Son of Origins, Bring on the Bad Guys, Superhero Women, all those. They were a wee bit self-reverential, those books. Did you read them? Did you read the copy that went with the reprints? They were classic reprints.
Yeah, oh yeah, I saw them and I bought them. You know, they didn't give us any free. But the thing about it is, I mean, I think Stan did kind of shortchange the artists and so forth. Now his explanation was, well, you know, if you mention one artist, then the other artist, you know, but that was just, you know, shadow stuff. That was just coverage. The basic thing was, by this stage, we're talking, what, early 70s, right? Well, what happened in 1970? Jack Kirby quit. Now, once he quit, nothing was ever going to quite be the same because of the way he quit, too. Just, he calls up Stan on the phone and says, I have quit. Not I'm quitting, I have quit. I'm working for DC. He wasn't really unkind, evidently, but, you know, very curt and short conversation, that's it. Now, if somebody does something like that to you, are you ever quite going to be worried about thinking about, boy, I got to give him credit again? He wasn't even working for the company at the time. And Stan was very much a company man, remember, you know.
But in fact, you may have the answer to this. You know, Jack always blamed Stan for getting him and Joe Simon fired in the 40s when Martin Goodman found out that they were working for the competition at the time. And Stan denied he had anything to do with it, which probably is truth, but Jack always somehow held a grudge over that.
Yeah, but we don't know what the truth of it is. Joe Simon said later, there were a lot of guys at DC knew they were coming out. It could have come from any number of sources. Besides, Stan at that time was a 17, 18-year-old kid. If you're going to hold, and Jack was a little older, you shouldn't have held it against him. But I think, I think that it was just the normal thing of, Stan taking a lot of credit. He was the face of Marvel. Jack was, he just drew. He wasn't interested in being out there in the public so much in those days. He just wanted to draw. And so who's going to get, more of the credit? Stan was given too much credit by people, even when he didn't seek it. Sometimes maybe he saw it a little